And now we're streaming on YouTube, so.
Yep.
Ryan, does Nathan need to be a co-host? I guess we already tested his screen share, so that worked fine.
No, so the only thing, as long as Roberta stops sharing, he'll be able to share. I mean, if he was the co-host, he could just basically kick Roberta off from screen sharing, but as long as Roberta is nice and stops her screen share.
Yeah, Roberta, like I said, what we usually do with Tracy is that as soon as I start introducing Nathan, you can stop the screen share and then he'll be able to share his slides.
Okay. And Ryan, for some reason, I can't see right now whether I'm co-host. Do you see it?
Yeah,
I
you're
can
co-host.
see, yeah, you're
Okay.
a co-host, yeah. It's I can see it in the participants window.
Okay, that's great.
Katie,
Yeah,
do you
and I
want
see the
me to
slide.
make you the actual host, or
Sorry, what was that?
you want me to make you the actual host?
Oh no, I mean, it doesn't matter, I think, unless you need me to do something.
No, I was just saying because whenever I hop off, just to make sure that it still stays up. I think
Oh, okay. If you're gonna hop off, then why don't you make me the host? Yeah.
Alrighty, there you go.
Okay, thanks, Ryan.
Yep.
Where are you, Katie? What's your background?
Oh, this is a picture I took when I was in Norway a couple of years ago.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
So this presentation will be available on YouTube later.
Yes, the recording should be linked to the recording should be posted on the CGD website.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, Nathan. Well, we're getting a pretty good group, so I'm happy to start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Nathan Mueller as our seminar speaker for today. Dr. Mueller is an assistant professor at Colorado State University, both in the departments of ecosystem science and sustainability and soil and crop sciences. His research analyzes the interactions between climate, water resources, and agricultural management to promote global food security and more sustainable agricultural landscapes. He received his bachelor's in biology and environmental studies from St. Olaf College in 2007, and his PhD in natural resource science and management from the University of Minnesota in 2013. He was an environmental fellow at Harvard University from 2013 to 2015, and an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science at UC Irvine before joining CSU in 2019. Most recently, he is a 2020 recipient of AGU's Global Environmental Change Early Career Award. Congrats, Nathan, on that great award. At CSU, he leads the Agricultural Sustainability and Climate Impacts Lab, where his group focuses on agricultural sustainability and climate impacts and adaptation. So today he will discuss adapting agriculture to climate change. Take it away, Nathan.
All right. Thank you, Katie, for that intro. And how is the screen sharing work? Does it look
good.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for the invitation. It's really good to be here and to also see quite a few familiar names on the attendee list. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy with the fires. I think we're all getting a little exhausted with the smoke, but so I want to start off by, well, I'm going to talk today on this big topic about how we adapt our agricultural systems to climate change. And I want to start this conversation off by acknowledging that there's been a lot of work in this area to try and better estimate climate change impacts on agriculture, and we've made a lot of progress. Just one example from the literature, this is not a paper I was involved in, but Zhao et al. 2017 compared a bunch of different methodological approaches for thinking about yield impacts per degree of temperature rise. And so you can see some emerging consensus, but also a fair bit of uncertainty still about, from these different methodological approaches. But these sort of analyses have some really important limitations. They tend to assume that the area of crops stays fixed into the future when these projections are done, that the type of cultivars that farmers are using stay the same, that the cropping calendars stay the same. So what does that mean? That means like when crops are planted and harvested and when they go through different phases of development, as well as fixed agronomic practices. But if we know anything about the history of agriculture, it's that it's basically constantly in flux. And so it sort of begs the question of, how can we adapt to climate change? How much can we adapt? And I think this field of climate adaptation really requires not just forward-looking scenario analyses, which I think are really important, but also retrospective evidence. So what can we understand by looking historically at different mechanisms of adaptation to try and see, is there evidence for adaptation occurring? What sort of mechanisms are at play, and so on and so forth. So it's helpful to just ground the discussion by going back to the IPCC definition of adaptation, which they define as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. So basically in human systems, we're either seeking to moderate or avoid the harm of climate change, or maybe you're experiencing a favorable change in climate for farming or whatever activity. And so adaptation could also be a way to exploit a new beneficial opportunity. I think when we focus in on agriculture specifically, I've found it helpful to start thinking about adaptation in a few different categories. The first category is in situ adaptations. So basically these are the types of on-farm changes in management that could either moderate or avoid harm or exploit the beneficial opportunities. So if say you're a corn farmer in Iowa, maybe you're thinking about changing your planting times or cultivars, or if you're a livestock farmer, maybe you're thinking about what sort of housing you're using or shading or other management practices. The second category is adaptive migration. So this would occur when there's the result of a whole bunch of individual choices about what crops people are going to grow or what rotations they're using, or if they want to diversify what they're growing or the type of livestock they're raising. And basically the end result of all of those decisions could be that the system as a whole, so read like soybeans, may start shifting geographically in ways that are may help avoid damages or exploit beneficial opportunities. And then lastly, I think there are a whole bunch of different adaptive changes that are really just focused on the infrastructure and support systems for agriculture, whether that's kind of the basic investments in crop breeding or thinking about irrigation infrastructure and water management. All right, so what I want to do today is give 3 examples from my work that have explored this idea of adaptation in one way or another. The first is looking at this in situ adaptation, focused in on US dairy systems. This is work that was led by Maria Gisbert Corral, who's a student working with me on this topic. The second one is looking at this adaptation by migration idea, and we looked at major rain-fed crops all across the world. This just was recently published in Nature Communications and was led by Lindsay Sloat, who's a postdoc working with me at CSU. And then the last is really not so much an explicit examination of adaptation, but more thinking about what the needs are for adaptation as a result of changes in snowmelt and how that might impact irrigated agriculture. So this was just published in Nature Climate Change and was led by Yue Chin, a postdoc working with me, who's now an assistant professor at Ohio State. So digging into dairy first, this is a new area for me, but one that was really fun to learn about. What we know is that the animal level responses to temperature and humidity are pretty well described in the animal science literature. But I'd argue that and sometimes those animal level responses are forced with climate change scenarios and extrapolated to climate impacts. But I would argue that the system level responses have been relatively unknown. And what do I mean by system level? I mean the kind of the real world damages that you see, not just when you look at an individual cow, but when you look at the whole farm, because farmers have different environmental control practices that they use to basically mediate or moderate their exposure to weather. So this can be as simple as barns, so housing, installing shading, using fans, misters, sprinklers, those sorts of things that can mean that maybe it's really hot out, but you can but the cow can experience less discomfort. So as context, dairy is something that occurs all across the country, but there's a lot of it in California, in the upper Midwest, and in the Northeast. Just like, and within Colorado, northern Colorado is where we see most of the dairies. Just like for crops, which have experienced increasing yield trends over time, milk yields have also gone up. And you can see right away from this graph that we actually have monthly level milk yield data, which is exciting. And so the question about climate change then is, are the climate trends basically contributing to this yield growth or acting as a drag on the yield growth? So maybe we would have gotten greater increases if it weren't for climate change. All right, so to look at the real world milk yield response to weather, we had to do a couple things. We took our monthly state level milk yields, and then we had PRISM data on temperature and humidity by county. And then we matched that up with basically the county level cow populations. Those come from the Census of Agriculture. So we know where within the states the cows are located, and then we can basically sample, we can weight the weather exposure accordingly. And we use THI down here on the x-axis. That's basically a heat stress index for cows. It, just like the heat index that we're used to, it combines, you know, temperature and humidity. And our regression model controls for technology trends and average seasonality and cross-sectional variability. But what pops out really clearly are both the effects of cold stress on the left and then heat stress on the right. So this blue line is basically describing here the marginal reduction in milk yield that you get from experiencing a level of THI of one level or another. So I thought it was one thing that was really interesting from the start on this was that there's a lot of discussion about heat stress, but not so much about cold stress. But it's sort of intuitive when you think about it, the animals are using energy to stay warm and the production goes down. And so when we think about climate change, it's really this balance of increasing heat stress and decreasing cold stress and kind of the net result of those things. But as we played around with our data a little bit more, we've uncovered a few other really interesting patterns. One of those is that there are actually some differences according to the average climate and what that THI response looks like. So on the left, I'm showing what that looks like. So basically, the warm states in the red are more sensitive to cold and less sensitive to heat than the cold states and vice versa. So that was kind of a first indication that there was some regional adaptation going on, which is, you know, pretty intuitive when you think about it. The places that have a lot of heat stress are more likely to invest in things that would help moderate that and vice versa. And then second, we found on the right that there were some really interesting differences over time. So the basically the response function, these coefficients shift towards zero in the latter half of the data set. So basically the whole system appears to be becoming less sensitive to weather of basically of any kind, which would correspond with farmers investing more in management and housing that basically just help cut off that link from what's happening with the weather and to what the cows are experiencing. So basically we're able to incorporate those interaction effects into the model. So we have an interaction for mean climate and an interaction with time. And as a result of that, we can tease apart estimates of state year specific response functions. And so I'm just showing you what that looks like for California here with the red line and the blue line. And so you can see that the whole system is relatively insensitive to weather as compared to what it used to be. If we think about the impacts of climate change, here on these maps, they show that the trends in terms of days. I apologize to anybody from Maine, as it appears I got Maine cut off there. But you could see basically we have, you know, decreases in the number of days that are experiencing cold stress. We have some increases going of optimal days, optimal conditions, basically that bin of THI that maximizes yield. And then we also have quite a bit of increase in terms of heat stress days. But we also had that big decrease in THI sensitivity. And so when we look at the effects of climate change and that change in THI sensitivity, where everything is much less sensitive to weather than it used to be, we see that there's a positive overall effect. The benefit is larger for northern states where there used to be more cold stress exposure. And on average, we're looking at about a 4.5% increase in yields. So it's not to say that producers are, basically before these dairy farmers were taking a hit from all this weather variability. And now they're taking a hit because they have to invest in all of these management practices and pay for them. And so it's not to say that they aren't impacted anymore, but they're sort of impacted in a different way. I want to just break that map apart into its components. So first, isolating the impacts of climate change alone, we can look at, basically at the THI sensitivity. So basically we use the 1981 response functions. If those had stayed the same, we would have seen these sort of patterns in terms of the impacts on yield, where there's actually more yield benefit than yield harm. And that was mostly due to that transition from the cold stress conditions into the more optimal conditions, outweighing the effects of the increased heat stress. If we look at the climate trends with the new response functions, there's basically no impact because now the system is so insensitive to weather variability. And then here's the benefit of that overall decline in THI sensitivity. So sensitivity to both the cold and the heat stress with the climate conditions circa 1981 and the climate conditions circa 2018. And basically these maps look more or less identical because it's a very helpful change in both cases, right? But if we take the difference of these maps and ask, are these changes in THI sensitivity more helpful under the recent climate or the historical climate? We actually see that they would have been slightly more helpful in the old climate, and that's because there was so much more cold stress before. And the big benefit of the reduction in THI sensitivity is ameliorating the impact of cold stress. So, of course, this is a helpful change regardless of the climate conditions, but it does get at this kind of subtle, a little bit technical point in the adaptation community about, what constitutes an adaptation to climate versus an adaptation to climate change. And, some people would be pretty stringent and say, it's only really an adaptation to climate change itself if it's more beneficial in the new climate than the old climate. And so these changes actually don't meet that test, but they're still very helpful regardless, which is pretty interesting. And of course, we're presuming this decreased sensitivity to THI results from these on-farm management practices, which would constitute this in situ adaptation. And so we're really keen to understand basically what management trends have been driving this change. All right, so I'd like to move on now from in situ adaptation to adaptation through migration. So this study, we looked at major rain-fed crops. We were fortunate, we were working with Deepak Ray and Jamie Gerber and Paul West at the University of Minnesota, who spent a lot of time compiling global census and survey data on crop areas. So basically these maps are informed by some remote sensing crop distributions combined with a whole bunch of, I think over 2 million data points on, I think county level areas of different crops. We're interested in rain-fed crops, specifically not irrigated, because they're the most directly sensitive to temperature. So to get at rain-fed areas specifically, we combined the crop area maps with crop-specific irrigation data from Stefan Siebert, and that allowed us to map out these trends in rain-fed crops. And so that's what you see on the left here for maize, wheat, rice, and soybean. A few interesting patterns are called out in these boxes. For example, the shift in maize area towards the northern Great Plains. You see for wheat shifts towards northern Europe, for rice towards northeast Asia. And in soybeans, there's just, in the US, there's also a north-south shift, but there's also basically this massive expansion in South America. All right, so we needed to come up with basically a test for adaptation through migration. And so we just sort of started at first principles. Basically, when would changes in area, when would migration of crops constitute adaptation? Well, we know from the literature that especially for rain-fed crops, very high temperatures are associated with poor rain-fed yields. So basically, the migration should help minimize exposure to those very hot temperatures. And if the migration accomplishes this task, then we're calling that migration adaptive. So to illustrate this, we put together this schematic here. This is think of it as a map with a bunch of grid cells, and the green shading basically constitutes crop area in each of those grid cells. And then on top of the map, we have these contour lines representing temperature. So we are going from a T1 time to a T2 time, and you can see that the contours shift, it warms. We're defining a counterfactual scenario here where the crop areas stay exactly the same as they were in T1. And then we compare that to what actually happened. So in all of these schematics, they're gonna translate to basically a time series graph here, going from T1 to T2. And then the gray dashed line is the temperature trend from the counterfactual. And then we want to compare that to what actually happened in real life as the crop areas moved. And so in our schematic, you can basically, this can go one of three ways. Maybe the crops moved basically towards the warmer conditions, and that would actually constitute a thermal niche expansion. And in that case, as you look over time, the trend in the upper bound of temperatures would actually be greater than this counterfactual scenario where all the crops stayed exactly the same. We could also have a scenario where the temperature trend is less than the counterfactual. And this would happen if basically if the crops basically moved with the climate, such that the actual trend in the upper bound of temperatures was flat, or at least less than the counterfactual. And if it was significantly less than the counterfactual, then we would call that adaptive migration. Or the last scenario is maybe the crops move around a little bit, but not in any coherent way with the shift in temperature. And in that case, the upper bound of temperature just tracks the same as the counterfactual. Okay, so basically these are the patterns that we were looking for as we investigated the data. And so here I'm showing you what that looks like for maize. since we just walked through the graphs, this should hopefully be somewhat obvious, but you see here that the red line is lower and significantly lower smaller slope than the counterfactual. In fact, it's about a 40% reduction in the warming trend. And I should mention that what we're looking at here is what we're calling the warm bound of growing season temperature. So these are average growing season temperatures, mean temperatures. And then we look at basically the 95th percentile of that distribution across the globe. And we use quantile regression to look at the trends in those. So that's why, because this is mean growing season temperature, that's why, even though we're looking at the 95th percentile, these aren't really astronomical values, but it's pretty hot when you consider that's the average over the entire growing season. So the climate data is from CRU, and then we have crop-specific growing seasons from Bill Sachs's data set. I don't know if Bill's on the call, but thank you for your data set, which lives on in many analyses. As we look at the other crops of interest, we see some similar patterns for rice. If we look down at wheat, the experience trend is actually negative slope, which is really interesting, but it's kind of popping back up in recent years. But in both of these cases, so for all the cereals, we're seeing significant adaptation. And then when we look at soybeans, basically due to that dramatic expansion in the tropics, we see thermal niche expansion. All right, so just to wrap up the thought on this adaptation through migration, I just want to emphasize that this is, been able to show, looking retrospectively, that this is an important process and mechanism of adaptation. And so basically anytime we see a projection of yields or production where the crop areas are held fixed into the future, we have to recognize that that's might be a pretty big assumption given how much crops have been moving around even over the past decades, during which climate trends were less dramatic than what they might be in the near future. Okay, and then the last study that I'd like to cover is this one looking at snowmelt for irrigation. And this is something that I, kind of had been in the back of my mind for a long time as just a really interesting, unique mechanism of risk for irrigated agriculture. And irrigated agriculture tends to be less sensitive to temperature or weather fluctuations directly, because there's not that influence of temperature on the soil moisture balance. But it's really dependent upon the sustainability of those water supplies. And especially after moving to the Western US, that becomes even more obvious. So the idea is basically, how do we, you think about, how do we get from this water storage and snowpack to these sorts of landscapes on the right? And this is really, to use the lingo of ecosystem services, this is really an ecosystem service that's provided by a lot of, natural ecosystems, mountainous ecosystems, to provide this surface water. But of course, it's under threat from climate change and thinking about snow droughts. We wanted to look at this globally, and the other global studies that were out there tend to be limited based on either data quality issues or focus on snowpack, but not necessarily runoff. And most, except for some regional studies, didn't actually consider those water resources from snowmelt in conjunction with the water demands. with I think one notable exception. So that was kind of what we wanted to do here. So we had to ask a few key questions. So basically, where is the irrigation water coming from? Is it coming from groundwater or surface water? Thankfully, my colleague in Germany, Stefan Siebert, has exhaustively collected agricultural census data on this division from political units around the world, and you can see basically the red areas are more dependent on groundwater and the blue areas are more dependent on surface water. And then we need to also know how much water is consumed by crop evapotranspiration. So we're looking at this global blue water consumption. So that's the additional water used by the crops that wasn't otherwise available from precipitation in the soil moisture. So if you assume that the crop water needs are met and it's an irrigated environment, then this is that additional ET. So we use the global crop water model and combine it with FAO stat historical irrigation data to basically track this time series. So that's kind of the demand side. So we have basically from those data sets, we get surface water demand for irrigation. Then we need to know something about the surface water supply and how much of that's coming from rainfall or snowmelt. So we collaborated with John Abatsoglu on this project and used his TerraClimate, so a water balance model. This has the advantage of being forced with pretty high resolution weather data, and so, or reanalysis data, and so it captures some of the effects of basically mountainous areas that kind of get eliminated when you have big grid cells and everything flattens out. And then the new calculations that John contributed to this was to basically at the grid cell level partition the runoff that's coming from rainfall versus snow melt at each time set. And then we did a bunch of additional validation with this. So unsurprisingly, high latitudes and high elevations are dominated by snowmelt runoff. But still might be a little surprising, even though the spatial pattern probably isn't surprising, maybe the magnitude of the blue colors is it's pretty high in a lot of key areas. And as we force the TerraClimate model with climate projections, we can see some pretty big projected declines in that snowmelt runoff ratio. Okay, so we then want to know basically where are these changes in snowmelt going to align with crop water consumption, and where can irrigated agriculture stay viable, or where are there risks emerging? So to do that, we have to reconcile the demand and supply at a monthly level by basin. And that's what I'm showing here for the San Joaquin Basin, which is, of course, kind of in southern part of the Central Valley in California. And you can see in the bars here, the bars show the demand, and most of this is irrigation, but we do incorporate estimates of demand for other sectors that don't amount to too much in these basins where there's a lot of irrigation, because irrigation is almost always the dominant water user. And then we compare that to the patterns of rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff. So these are the blue and red lines, and basically just do a very simple accounting scheme every month to partition the demand into according to the available rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff. And then when we know when when basically there's demand that is being met, but there's not supply available in that month, then it must be met by alternatives, which are either stored water in reservoirs from that basin or interbasin transfers like water projects. And then looking at the climate projections, you can basically see there's a whole lot more rainfall runoff when you don't want it in the middle of the winter, and a lot less snowmelt runoff when we do want it, when it's really important for the agricultural water needs in late spring and early summer. And so we can basically look then at the changes in how crop water demands are expected to be met according to these different categories, right? And for snowmelt dependent basins, what we're really concerned about are the areas where the snowmelt consumption is going down and the alternative consumption is going up, because that's going to place a lot of demand on the water infrastructure. So basically that's what we've got here. On the X is the irrigation demand being met by snowmelt. So going down across a lot of these different basins. And then on the Y is the percentage point change in the share of irrigation demand that's met by alternative sources. So you can think of this as being, going from less vulnerable to more vulnerable. And these are all basins in the scatter plot that are dependent on snowmelt for irrigation currently. We were additionally interested in trying to characterize the relative vulnerability of these different basins based on their infrastructure availability. So we used this data set of global reservoirs and just looked at the total storage capacity and compared that to the alternative water demands. So that's this reservoir storage index. And basically the lighter colors imply greater flexibility. So you're using less of your existing storage currently, under this projected scenario. And the dark colors mean that you're basically using all of the storage capacity. And remember too that, reservoirs are managed for multiple uses, including, water supply for cities and power and all sorts of other things. So it's not necessarily easy to just adapt to these changes. But more or less, that was the main intent, was then to try and characterize the basins where adaptation is really needed and where agriculture is really at risk. And so these are the main basins that popped out. We more or less came up with this index by multiplying this axis times this axis for every basin that falls up in this quadrant. And so you can see that mapped out here. So Western US, not a big surprise, a little bit in coastal Chile, in Southern Europe, and then a lot in kind of Central Asia area. And so the adaptation options to deal with these changes are, shifting the way that the reservoirs are managed. If possible, shifting from surface water to groundwater use, but in many cases, the groundwater supplies are already overstretched. Crop switching to maybe more lower water use crops, or the big one is would be a shift to just dry land farming, which would entail lower value of production and probably more extensive than what's currently done. So, just as one example in this basin in Asia, the alternative water demands we saw already reach greater than 70% of the available reservoir capacity under this projected scenario. And only 5% of current irrigation is met by groundwater, meaning suggesting there's not a whole lot of flexibility to switch into groundwater. So that means maybe more dryland uses would be necessary if this comes to pass. So anyways, you get the idea that with the sort of data that we have together, we can start looking basin by basin at these different the contexts. All right, so I think I'm doing okay on time. We should have a bit of time for questions, but I want to wrap up by, emphasizing that in the dairy study, we saw this really big decrease in sensitivity to THI. And we also saw these existing patterns of kind of regional adaptation. So that was all very encouraging as far as the risks to this system and the role of adaptation, but it does mean that farmers are still paying costs. They're now paying for the cost of these management practices in situ. When we look at migration, it is already occurring, and we're seeing these adaptive shifts in the cereal distributions. So that's encouraging that could help, minimize harm to cropping systems globally by changes in their spatial distribution, and that it is an important mechanism to think about going forward. But also we have to recognize that every time that happens, when you see, shifts from one crop into another, it's because, at a local level, something wasn't working for the farmer, and they saw the need to make the change or the opportunity to make the change. So it's not that there aren't harms occurring locally, but that at a system level, this migration could be very helpful. And then looking at the snowmelt case, we saw this decreased magnitude and earlier timing of snowmelt runoff, and that kind of speaks to the need to think about how we adapt our water management in these basins that really rely on snowmelt. So I think, hopefully I've convinced you that adaptation is basically of first order importance for determining climate impacts. That it's hopefully helpful to think a little bit about categories of adaptation, whether they're in situ, thinking about migration, or changes in infrastructure and support systems. And then, as much as we all like to think about the future and investigate different scenarios, I think hopefully I've also convinced you that it's really helpful to look retrospectively and to see what sort of evidence we have of adaptation occurring in the past, and that can kind of help inform what we think about for the future. So with that, I'll say thanks and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Nathan. That was a nice overview of quite a bit of diversity of work that your group is doing on this topic of agriculture and climate change. So if you have a question for Nathan, you can use the raise your hand feature, which is in the participants window, and we can call on you. You can ask your question out loud, or you can type your question in the chat box and I can read it out loud. Gordon, go ahead.
Hey, Nathan. Hi, this is Gordon. That was a great talk.
Thanks.
You focused mostly on the impacts of climate change on crops and adaptations to climate change. And I was wondering about the other side of it. You've done really nice work looking at how agricultural intensification in the Midwest has sort of changed the climate of the Midwest. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on whether agricultural management is a useful way to think about sort of mitigating climate change itself.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. That's a really great question. Yeah, so in some previous work, I looked at climate trends in the Midwest and intensification, both intensification of rain-fed crops and also the expansion of irrigation, and found that increased evapotranspiration from these more productive landscapes was really had a moderating influence on extreme temperatures and helped decrease the temperature extremes. So absolutely, I would say that, you know, it's almost like a geoengineering type of perspective, right? Because we have 40% of almost 40% of the Earth's surface in either croplands or pastures, and we're already managing those landscapes and often in pretty intensive ways. And so we can bear in mind how what we do with those landscapes can absolutely help from a mitigation perspective. And I think it's both from thinking about the sort of biophysical pathways. So any sort of increase in irrigation or increase in productivity could help moderate temperatures by increasing ET. But we can also think about using these landscapes from a biogeochemical perspective in terms of how we use them to store carbon. There's of course tons of attention on soil health and carbon storage in agricultural soils these days, and I think some competing views on just quite how large that potential is. But I think it's clear that there is potential to sequester carbon in agricultural soils. So yeah, it's huge potential for agriculture for basically climate change mitigation through multiple pathways. And I guess my last comment on that is I even saw there's a paper thinking about, I've been a couple of papers thinking about albedo of crops, either of the crops that are growing and how that might be manipulated via changes in the leaf surface, or also, you know, thinking about how we manage the crops in terms of harvest, and if we do no-till and leave more residue on the surface, that can create a more reflective surface than if the land is tilled and it's black dirt, basically.
Great. So there's a question that's come in from Jean in the chat, so I'll read that. Did you or others in your group, or are others in your group looking at productivity as in outputs over inputs to consider the cost of adaptation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not looked at that, I think, basically more economic component that's being alluded to. That's something that I'd really like to do in terms of the dairy case, because I think it's so striking in terms of how dramatically the system has reduced its sensitivity to weather. But you know, you've got to imagine that the farmers are spending a lot of money to build more barns and using more energy for fans and more water for sprinklers and misters and those sorts of things. So that's not something that I've looked at in that case, but I'd really love to. In another study, we did look at some changes in the cropping calendar to maize in the Midwest. So basically, people are moving to plant varieties with that they actually plant them earlier, and then they have a longer grain filling period, so they are more productive in that way. And we found that to be a positive adaptation in the Corn Belt. And in that case, you know, there's nothing different about what the farmer is doing other than getting it into the field earlier. So we wouldn't expect that has a big cost, but it did have a benefit.
Great. Dave has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Great talk. It's interesting or cool that you found that evidence of adaptation already occurring with this migration of cropping, and I'm curious how you understand that happens, because how are the farmers making the decisions? Because there's a lot of environmental variability. The climate change signal, while is detectable, it's kind of subtle, definitely on a year-to-year basis. So I'm curious how this is actually happening. Is there some organization that's helping farmers make decisions? Are they random walking it and just sticking with what ends up being the most productive in terms of the money they're earning? Or
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question, and one that the reviewers on our paper definitely challenge us on. Our response to the reviewers and to you now is basically that we more or less can't say with in any definitive way why these farmers are making the decisions that they are, just that we're able to detect this adaptive benefit of what is already occurring. So that's the careful answer, but the more speculative answer is that I would guess, like climate is playing a role, but is probably not necessarily the central thing that the farmers are thinking about when they're making their decision. It's probably, oh, it's just that this other crop represents a better investment. And so I'm gonna make the switch. Or, there were some places where we saw decreases in rain-fed area because farmers were actually switching to irrigated production. And so that's something where the farmers, saw it in their interest to make that investment. And of course, there's a big cost associated with irrigation, but a big benefit in terms of the productivity gain. So yeah, so I think it's super fascinating to me, to what extent climate enters in as a kind of a direct consideration, or is it more indirect? And that's something where I think our social scientist colleagues could probably teach us a lot, and there's probably a lot we can do together on those topics.
Cool. Well, we still have time for questions. I'll ask a question about this concept of dryland farming, since I wasn't familiar with it, and what that might look like for Colorado, since I assume also groundwater is limited. Is it how distinct is it from just switching crops? Is it maintaining the same crops but employing other techniques for that type of approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the whole word dryland is sort of interesting. I think it gets used more in these contexts like Colorado, where there's a mix of rain-fed and irrigated agriculture, but dryland is basically the rain-fed production that we have. And so in the case of Colorado, we have certain areas that are pretty heavily irrigated, and then other places that are, totally rain-fed and dry land. And our dry land systems, there's a lot of winter wheat. So where the crop is planted, around nowish, and then grows a little bit and is dormant over the winter, but then is established to take advantage of kind of the moisture that's available in the spring and the early summer, and then it matures and it's harvested really early, compared to, say, in Iowa growing corn, where you plant it in the spring and harvest it in the late fall. So it's just more adapting the system to take advantage of whatever water resources are available naturally, rather than getting those through irrigation. But it's inevitably going to be, less productive than what you could accomplish with irrigation.
Great, thanks. Last call for questions. Donica.
Hey Nathan, thanks for the great talk. I'm just curious if we're shifting what crops are growing where, what does that mean in terms of meeting the dietary demands or needs of society, and how does that, how should we be considering that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. We didn't analyze it directly in the context of kind of food self-sufficiency, but I think that's kind of what your question alludes to, is a lot of countries have supports for the agricultural sector, in part because they would rather have domestic production and not totally be dependent on imports. And it gets at this idea more in the social sciences and humanities about food sovereignty and being able to have locally what people want to consume. And so yeah, I think it's inevitable that these shifts are going to probably cause some mismatch between what the local demand is and the local supply, and be really interesting to investigate that farther out into the future, where I think you might see, you apply a bigger hammer, you might see some more dramatic mismatches between local diets and what has been suitable in that area and what may or may not be suitable in the future.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I guess maybe we'll close it out. But thank you, Nathan, so much for coming and talking to us about your group's work. Thanks everyone for the questions. And next week we have Rob Wills presenting from the University of Washington. So thanks again.
Thanks, Katie.